In the vast and intricate story of Scripture, God does not reveal himself in isolated flashes or detached decrees. His self-disclosure unfolds in patterns that sustain meaning and shape existence. What emerges is not merely theology or history, but architecture, a structure in which divine presence, human agency, and the flow of time converge and interact. These first four triads reveal a profound progression: the establishment of sacred space where God and humanity meet, the formation of responsive action and authority, the birth of ethical community from transcendent encounter, and finally the tragic unraveling of that community when continuity is lost. Each triad shapes and deepens the next, moving from the balanced coexistence of divine meeting to the haunting retrospective of broken legacy. This architecture is not only ancient, it frames the very conditions of our spiritual lives today. Sacred encounter arises where human approach and divine response meet within a structured pattern of movement, offering, and presence. It is not merely a moment of awe, but an architecture that allows access to transcendence. This structure requires not just intention, but mediation and reception. Threshold, offering, and transformation must align. It is through this frame that the elements of worship take on meaning, and through which the divine reveals itself in fire. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat portions on the altar. Leviticus 9:23-24. The first movement in this architecture is balance, the mutual interdependence of access, sacrifice, and divine response. The altar stands as the locus where the mundane is lifted into the sacred, the place where what is offered becomes the medium of communion between humanity and God. Yet the altar cannot serve its purpose alone. The gate defines the threshold between common ground and holy space. It marks the moment of decision and transition where the human heart crosses from self-will into submission and offering. But even with the altar prepared and the gate crossed, something more is required. The fire, the unmistakable sign of divine presence that does not merely accept the offering, but transforms it, consuming and purifying simultaneously. These three elements do not function in isolation. Without the gate, there is no access to the altar. The worshipper remains outside, uninitiated. Without the fire, the altar remains cold, a symbol without efficacy. And without the altar itself, the fire has no resting place, no material reality to sanctify. The triad forms a dynamic equilibrium in which sacred presence flows through access, offering, and divine response. It is not merely a static structure, but a living system where God and humanity meet in a balanced dance of approach, surrender, and transformation. This is where all sacred encounter begins. Authority, when rightly ordered, is not imposed from above, but emerges through a living relationship between revelation, human agency, and sustained power. It begins in the articulation of will, takes form in response, and is confirmed in enduring structure. This is not mere hierarchy, but a cycle where truth is enacted and upheld. The following triad explores how this form of authority takes hold in history. Then I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll, and they sang a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe. Revelation 5:1-9. From the balanced coexistence of the sacred meeting, the architecture progresses into a system of reinforcement, a self-sustaining cycle of revelation, human response, and divine authority. The scroll represents the articulated will of God, the written testimony of divine intention and purpose. It is the record of covenant, command, and promise. But the scroll, like the altar, cannot act alone. The hand signifies human agency, the empowered response to revelation. It is the movement from hearing to doing, from passive reception to active obedience. When the hand takes hold of the scroll's commands and embodies them, authority is not only acknowledged, but enacted. This leads inevitably to the throne, the seat of established sovereignty, where order is maintained and justice administered. Yet the throne does not stand as the terminal point. It circles back to the scroll by legitimating and protecting the revelation from which it arose. Authority is not imposed from above in arbitrary fashion. It emerges from the cycle of revelation received, acted upon, and upheld. Without the scroll, the hand becomes lawless. Without the hand, the scroll remains mere words. Without the throne, both become fragile, subject to the winds of time and rebellion. This is the architecture by which divine will enters human history and takes root as enduring structure. It is the foundation not only of spiritual life but of all righteous authority in families, churches, and nations. A true community shaped by covenant is more than a social contract. It is the result of revelation taking ethical form and finding life in shared identity. This is not accidental belonging, but a community called into being by divine initiative, ordered by transcendent instruction. The sequence that follows shows how a people is not only gathered, but constituted through encounter. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai, and God spoke all these words, Exodus 19:20-21. Having established the cycle of revelation and authority, the architecture now unfolds into linear causation, the forward movement from divine encounter to communal formation. The mountain represents the point of transcendent meeting, the origin where God descends and humanity ascends in a moment of radical disclosure. From this encounter emerges the law, not as arbitrary decree, but as the articulation of divine character in ethical form. The law structures human behavior according to the transcendent values revealed on the mountain. From the law, in turn, comes the assembly, the gathered community who hears, receives, and embodies the divine will in corporate life. These elements are bound in a causal chain. The mountain causes the law causes the assembly. Without the mountain, the law loses its authority and the assembly cannot form. Remove the source, and the community collapses, reduced to a crowd with no unifying purpose or identity. Here, revelation moves from the vertical, God's descent, to the horizontal, human society, creating a people who are not merely subjects of command but participants in a shared covenantal life. The architecture deepens. Encounter becomes ethics. Ethics becomes community. There are failures so profound they do not merely halt progress, they undo meaning itself. In such collapse, the future does not just fail to materialize, it reaches backward, erasing promise, disrupting continuity, and leaving silence where there should have been legacy. This triad traces that unraveling, where the end robs the beginning of its purpose. So Saul died for his unfaithfulness. He did not inquire of the Lord, so the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David. 1 Chronicles 10:13-14. But architecture, like all structures, is vulnerable not only to time, but to neglect, rebellion, and failure. The fourth triad introduces the haunting logic of retrospective collapse. The shattered line signifies the broken continuation of history, where lineage and legacy are disrupted. The forfeited birth represents unrealized potential, the destiny that was promised but never actualized. The silent legacy is the future without a voice or vessel, where the covenant has no heirs to carry it forward. What is most sobering here is the retroactive nature of the collapse. When the silent legacy is lost, the meaning of the shattered line evaporates. The forfeited birth reveals that what once seemed like a hopeful beginning was, in fact, stillborn. The breakdown does not merely interrupt the flow of history, it reaches backward, unmaking the past and dissolving its significance. Without a future, even the memory of origins becomes hollow. This is not just Israel's story. It is the story of every generation that fails to transmit its values, every community that loses its reason for being, every family that forgets its covenantal purpose. The loss is not merely a failure of the present, but a retroactive voiding of all that came before. Exclusion is not always passive. At times it becomes a system, an architecture that actively denies access, interrupts generativity, and strips identity. This is not merely about those left outside, but about the structures that ensure they remain so. What follows is a pattern of deliberate severance, where entry, origin, and recognition are all withheld. Woe to you, experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering. Luke 11:52. Here we witness not just a passive unraveling, but an active exclusion. The sealed threshold represents the closure of access. Where once the gate opened to the altar, now the boundary is shut. Transition and decision are denied, and those who once might have crossed into sacred space find the way barred. Behind this threshold lies the barren source, a place that once gave life and renewal but now stands desolate. The spring has not merely dried up by neglect, it has been sealed against generativity. And with this, the withheld mark emerges, the visible sign of belonging and covenant now refused or removed. Without the mark, recognition within the covenant community is denied, and the individual is rendered spiritually nameless. The interaction among these elements is not merely sequential, but mutually reinforcing in their negation. Without access through the sealed threshold, no one can reach the source. Without a fertile source, there can be no new life to receive the mark. And without the mark, even if the threshold and source were restored, identity would remain unclaimed. Exclusion is complete, not simply the absence of inclusion, but the deliberate denial of the possibility itself. The architecture that once welcomed now actively resists, a fortress of abandonment. There is a kind of absence that feels like abandonment, not the simple loss of presence, but the hollowing out of all the forms that once held meaning. When the symbols remain but their substance is gone, the result is disorientation. This triad confronts the breakdown of divine communication, where the sacred center becomes a void. Ichabod saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God had been captured." 1 Samuel 4:21. Exclusion leads to a still deeper constriction, not merely of access but of presence itself. The vacant ark stands as a hollow center. Once the resting place of testimony, the ark now contains no witness. It is not only inaccessible, it is empty. Above it, the obscured seat, the mercy seat where judgment and forgiveness once converged, is clouded, offering neither clarity nor comfort. Those who approach find no discernible presence of mercy or justice. And around this silence resonates the muffled echo. The divine voice, which once thundered from Sinai and whispered to prophets, now fades into incomprehensibility. It is not entirely gone, but it cannot be grasped or rightly interpreted. This triad represents a bottleneck, where sacred communication breaks down at every level. Without the testimony of the vacant ark, there is no foundation for mercy or judgment. Without the clarity of the seat, the voice becomes noise. Without a comprehensible voice, the ark and seat lose even their symbolic meaning. It is not simply that God is withdrawn, but that every avenue of perceiving him has constricted into near oblivion. Presence is hollowed out, and the place once known for divine dwelling becomes a void. The loss has moved from external exclusion to internal spiritual suffocation. Identity, to endure, must be more than memory. It must be transmitted. It lives not just in individuals, but in the line that binds past to future. This triad explores the structure of generational continuity, where belonging is preserved and the covenant resounds through lineage and name. Even amid fracture, this is the architecture that remembers. But the steadfast love of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him, to those who keep his covenant and remember to do his commandments. Psalm 103:17-18. Yet at this very point, where exclusion has closed access and communication has narrowed to a whisper, the architecture surprises us. The next triad is not one of further decline, but of resonance. The house represents the generational structure, the enduring lineage that holds together memory, identity, and communal belonging. The sons are the living expression of the house's continuity, the future bearing the past into new realities, and the name is the binding identity that unites them both. It is more than a label. It is the summation of history, covenant, and destiny. Their interaction restores mutual coherence. Where house and sons remain, the name persists. Where the name and house endure, the sons cannot be forgotten. Where sons and name are preserved, the house can be rebuilt, even if damaged. Unlike the prior triads of negation, this one operates on a harmonic principle. Each element sustains and revives the others. Even amid fracture, disinheritance, or exile, identity reasserts itself through generational memory and covenant fidelity. The architecture shifts from bottleneck to echo chamber, not the fading of voice into silence, but the resonance of identity against all odds. There are moments when the bonds that link heaven and earth, self and purpose, are violently undone. Not all struggle transforms, not all ladders ascend. When identity is scattered, effort becomes directionless and the self unmoored. This triad outlines a collapse of coherence, where alienation becomes total. They will stumble over each other as if fleeing from the sword, even though no one is pursuing them. Leviticus 26:37. The first sign of disintegration is the severed struggle. Struggle itself is not foreign to covenant life. Jacob wrestled with God and was transformed into Israel. Struggle, when rightly oriented, leads to blessing and identity. But when the struggle is severed, disconnected from purpose, it becomes fragmentation without transformation. The fallen ladder continues the descent. Where once there had been communion between realms, the bridge between heaven and earth shown to Jacob in his dream, the connection has collapsed. The gap between God and humanity is no longer traversable. The result is the dispersed name. Name, which once bound identity and destiny into coherent purpose, is scattered into fragments. The people no longer know who they are, nor do they remember who they were meant to become. Unlike the retrospective collapse of Triad 4, this is not merely a loss of continuity, but of convergence itself. The struggle no longer leads upward. The ladder cannot bridge realms. The name dissolves into incoherence. Each element's negation amplifies the others. This is the crisis of ultimate alienation, rupture in heaven, on earth, and in the self. To be human is to stand in tension between heaven and earth, to be formed of dust and filled with breath. The image we bear is neither fully divine nor merely material, but a synthesis of both. This triad returns us to the origin of this paradox, where mortality and spirit co-create identity. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And yet, it is precisely into this alienation that the architecture introduces a new and ancient paradox, the reconstitution of humanity itself. The breath signifies the divine spirit, the animating power from above. The dust embodies human mortality and materiality, the earthbound reality from below. Out of the union of these emerges the image humanity as the paradoxical being formed from both divine presence and earthly frailty. This triad does not erase the previous collapse. It integrates it. The breath and dust together form the image anew, but the image is no longer naive or untested. It bears the scars of dispersion and the memory of fracture. If either breath or dust is missing, the image cannot stand. Spirit without matter is formless. Matter without spirit is inert. But together they embody a new anthropology, one that holds divine absence and presence in tension. The collapse has not been reversed, it has been transfigured. Redemption does not begin in the center. It begins on the edges, where the voiceless dwell and the shepherd hears what others ignore. The ecology of salvation includes the creaturely, the guiding, and the calling. This triad maps a relational structure in which the marginal is not lost, but gathered. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. John 10:11. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Isaiah 40:3. From the reconstitution of the image, the architecture expands outward into an ecology of redemption. The beast represents the vulnerable and unspeaking creature, the instinctive world of those who cannot articulate their need, but who nevertheless long for care. The shepherd is the one who guides, protects, and gathers the stray. He does not only watch the flock, but responds to the deeper call of divine purpose. That call is the voice in the wilderness, the prophetic utterance that reaches those outside the established boundaries, summoning both shepherd and beast into new belonging. Here the dynamic is not one of simple hierarchy, but of association. The shepherd hears the voice and acts on behalf of the beast. The beast responds not to command, but to the shepherd's care. The voice transcends both, offering a divine summons that reorders the creaturely world. What was once dispersed begins to reconverge, not by human initiative alone, but by a divine call that seeks even the marginal and the mute. At the heart of all sacred structure is mystery, hidden yet present, moving yet inhabiting, eternal yet near. The final triad draws us into the integrated presence of God, where identity, dwelling, and movement come together not to answer all questions, but to reveal that God chooses to be with. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Exodus chapter 40, verse 34. Finally, the architecture reaches its fulfillment, not in a return to the original balance of the altar, gate, and fire, but in the integration of presence, movement, and identity. The cloud signifies the hidden presence of God, moving with the people yet never fully revealed. It is the mystery that guides without dominating. The tabernacle represents structured habitation, the constructed space where the holy dwells among the people. It transforms the transient movement of the cloud into tangible presence. And at the heart of both stands the I Am, the eternal essence of divine identity, not confined by space or time, yet willing to dwell within them. Their interaction transcends all previous patterns. The cloud leads but does not yet reveal fully. The I Am declares identity but seeks habitation. The tabernacle receives both, becoming the nexus where movement, form, and being converge. This is not a cyclical return to Eden, but a forward-moving fulfillment. Revelation has become habitation. Mystery has become presence. The architecture of presence, once fragmented, has been reintegrated, not despite disintegration, but through it. What is unfolded before us in these triads is not merely a system of ideas or an abstract theological model. It is the deep architecture of how God meets humanity, how human agency responds or fails, and how time itself becomes the medium of revelation, collapse, and restoration. We began with balance, the sacred equilibrium where the divine and human meet in structured encounter. We followed the emergence of authority, the formation of covenant community, and then, inevitably, the consequences of fracture, exclusion, absence, and the retroactive unmaking of purpose. These were not random events in biblical history. They are the recurring patterns of human experience whenever covenantal relationship is embraced or abandoned. Yet even in the most grievous collapse, when thresholds are sealed, sources barren, the ark vacant, the voice muffled, and the struggle severed, the architecture never permitted absolute disintegration. Instead, within the deepest fractures, the memory of identity echoed. The house, the sons, and the name resounded even when the symbols of sacred order had failed. The breath and dust came together again to remake the image, not as an innocent beginning but as a redeemed paradox. Out of alienation emerged not despair, but a reconstitution grounded in tension, divine presence and human frailty, absence and hope, mortality and glory held in one embodied identity. What followed was astonishing. Not a retreat to the center, not a re-establishment of former structures, but an expansion outward. The shepherd hears the voice in the wilderness and moves toward the margins to gather even the voiceless beast. Authority is no longer hoarded, but exercised as care. The divine call does not merely repair what was lost, but draws new lines of belonging where none existed before. It is the transformation of fracture into redemptive ecology. At last, the cloud, the tabernacle, and the I Am bring the architecture to its final form. Not a cycle returning to its start, but a linear fulfillment where mystery chooses to dwell. Revelation becomes habitation. Movement becomes presence. Identity becomes communion. The fragmented elements of history are not discarded or forgotten. They are integrated into a new, transcendent unity. The divine does not merely visit, it indwells. The sacred presence that once consumed offerings in fire now fills a tent of meeting, now fills a people, now fills all creation. This then is the testimony of the triads. God meets. Humanity responds. Structures form. Collapse comes. But from collapse emerges resonance, reconstitution, expansion, and finally, integration. Not despite fracture, but through it. This is the architecture of Scripture. It is the architecture of covenant. And it is the architecture of every soul who passes through encounter, authority, community, loss, and by grace into restoration.